Configuring printing for View desktops. Are you ready for more group policy? Because, well, that's what printing is in VMware View. And it's really oddly designed. It makes sense why it was designed that way, but you kind of have to register this DLL in order to make the group policy printing functionality work for VMware View. So you'll see here that one of the things we're actually going to do in this nugget is register a thin print DLL file. Okay, so printing. If you've played with terminal services or remote desktop services for really any period of time, then you are probably familiar with the sometimes awesome, but sometimes awful experience that can be printing in server-based computing environments. Back in the old days, printing was just awful. Uh, RDS was not really well tailored for configurations over the WAN, at least as it relates to printing. And so, person would print document. That print command would go through the RDP stream, end up at the server, and then the server would essentially render that print job either to a local network print server and printer, which was not great if the user was on the other side of the WAN, or would have to traverse that entire print job over the WAN in its very uncompressed mode. Well, what we're trying to do here with some of the newer technologies as it relates to printing is eliminate that decompression of those print jobs so that they can traverse the WAN and get printed on local computers in a much better way. Right? That's a lot of data going through. If you've actually paid attention to any of my CBT Nuggets videos on Citrix and XenApp, I kind of talk about when it relates to printing, you can kind of think of printing as a really long snake, where the snake corresponds to the communications path between the client and the server, and the thickness of the snake corresponds to how much data is going across. Well, the snake is probably, it's not that big around, right? But snakes occasionally have to have dinner. And when a snake has dinner, it goes and finds itself its little rat that it has to eat. And when it eats that rat, you've seen the National Geographic videos where the rat's kind of making its way down the belly of the snake from one end to the other. And it's that sort of bloop sort of look to the way that that thing is progressing down that always comes to my mind when I think about clicking a print job when that print job hasn't been optimized for use over the WAN. You've got a large amount of data that has to pass over what is really a narrow pipe, and so it can sometimes take a very long period of time. As a consequence, the whole configuration of printing in desktop virtualization, because you're using the RDP protocol in some cases, but it's the same way with PC over IP. It requires many of the same decisions that you would make in a TS or RDS environment. So what are you getting here? Okay, built into VMware View, what assists with this? There is a technology called thin print that VMware View can use. You can turn it on and tell it essentially to be used anytime you're connecting to local printers. And you can also instruct which printers that you want to automatically connect based on various configurations. So there's an optimization piece to this. But there's also a configuration piece to this because you might want to turn on printing for certain circumstances, but not for other circumstances. In fact, I'll kind of show you how it works. I don't know. The way it's constructed is a little interesting, but it does what it needs to do. There are two steps to it. The first is registering the DLL file, which doesn't take that long. It's just a command line. And then the second is actually configuring up the GPOs that you need to and the GPO settings that you need to. I do kind of want to just spend a minute here and via the whiteboard, just kind of explain what this process is. If my visual image of the snake and the rat are not, resonating with you, hopefully maybe this will. Okay, so let's assume that I have, for example, a set of users, okay, or an environment, okay. On one side of the environment, I've got my data center, okay, and I'm in Denver today, so let's just call that data center here in Denver. And I may have users here in Denver, and those users may be interacting with their virtual machines, which is totally copacetic because that's the whole reason why we're here today. So these virtual machines, they're interacting with virtual machines, and maybe occasionally that user then also needs to click print, and so they click print, and the printer is local because the printer is in Denver, and so that process is relatively easy. We're talking land speed here. Right? And over land speed, it doesn't really matter. This to this to this doesn't really matter that much, because even if we're decompressing those print jobs and printing them out in the raw mode, then it's okay because I don't have much latency here. I've got ample bandwidth. But let's say I have another environment over here to the left, right? And I've got a user out here in this other environment. He's way, way, way over in, I don't know, Mars or something. So way, way, way off in our branch office on that other planet, I've got, communication between this user and his or her virtual desktop, right? That user's got to work with their virtual desktop. They're connecting over PC over IP, or maybe they're connecting over RDP. There's some sort of communication path that occurs between him way, 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 way out, thousands of miles away in Mars, and their virtual desktop here in Denver. As an aside, I don't know if the latency here would be worthwhile. If you ever do have a branch office in Mars, let me know how the latency goes. Anyway, when that person prints, the likelihood that that person is going to want to print to this printer is fairly low. Right? If the user is on Mars and they need to print and the print job spits out in Denver, well, it's going to take a while for that print job to get mailed to that person. They probably have a local printer, right? One that's attached directly to their computer. So they've got some sort of device that they're running their virtual desktop on, and perhaps that device has a local printer, or maybe a network printer, or some sort of printer that's local to them on this planet and not on this planet. And so what they really want is they want to keep those jobs in as compressed a situation as possible, or as compressed a form as possible, so that when they click print, well, then it prints to this local printer as fast as possible with best performance. They don't want that job to get decompressed at the virtual machine and then sent over the wire in raw form back here to this printer. And so that's really what we're talking about when we're discussing location-based printing or thin print or any of these sort of print configurations as it's associated with VMware View. We want to support local printers and local print jobs, but we also need to support people that are way out in alternate locations, whether they be on this planet or another one. So here we are back in the VMware View Administrator. Again, same situation like before. But once again, we are not actually going to be doing printer configuration here from within the VMware View Administrator. VMware hasn't pulled that functionality into VMware View Administrator, and so we've got to get back here on our domain controller, dc.company.pri. I don't have to do it on the DC. It's just, it makes it simple for you to at least grok the differences and where these things are. So if you recall, I downloaded the files from VMware.com, and we've been working with this group policy files folder that I copied to this location because we're going to need it over and over again. We've worked with these ADMs before. We've been managing these ADMs. And in addition to these ADMs, there's also this thin print folder that I've kind of glossed over, purposely ignored up until this point. In the thin print folder is a 32-bit and 64-bit version of what is effectively a DLL. This DLL is the thin print DLL thing, right? The idea here is that this DLL needs to get registered so that Group Policy Management Console can make use of this whole mapping utility that's baked into this DLL. In fact, so here's the location for it on this computer. It's in the desktop. What I've done is I've actually copied that here to this location. So the command you want is reg svr32, and then the path to that DLL file, right? All I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat. I'm going to change this to a batch file. And if I run this command, you'll see that it actually registers that DLL file to whatever computer I'm about to run the group policy management console on. Okay? That's the only reason why I'm doing that. That's the majority of the reasons why I'm doing this. So once I've done that, okay, then the next step is to work with group policy or to create a new group policy. So let's do configure view location-based printing. All right. Hit OK. Then we're going to choose Edit over here. And I'm going to go to Policies. And this time I'm going to go to Software Settings. Aha, wait a minute. This is not an administrative template. This is actually something that gets cooked into software settings here. This Auto Connect map for additional printers is a little tool, a little widget that actually allows me to set up what I want my rules to be for which printers should get mapped to which people, and also why. So you'll see if I scroll over to the right here, I need to first set this thing to enabled. Be very careful here. If you set this to disabled, it'll clear all your rules out. And it's not very friendly about the way it does it either. So be very careful about clicking disabled there. Once I turn it to enabled, I can then insert a row. Okay, there's my row. Now you notice the second through fifth columns here identify the IP range, a client name, a MAC address, and a user or group. Okay, and they start out with stars here. The notion is that I can change these to restrict or constrict this rule to a specific IP range or to a specific client name. I can use wildcards here if I've got clients that are named appropriately. Same thing with MAC addresses. I can use asterisk to match MAC addresses. I can with IP addresses, set in a list of them. So like 1.2.3.4 through 1.2.3.100. Or I can use, for example, 192.168.0-0/24. So there's my 24-bit subnet mask, 255.255.255.0. That's the entirety of that IP range. The more constraints I put in, obviously, the fewer people are going to get it. With that, then, I need to identify what the printer name is and the driver for that printer. Okay, so the printer name is just a identification, okay, that identifies what the name of the printer is going to be. Okay, this name does not need to match the printer name on the client system. Okay, so this is just some printer name that I'm giving it. The printer driver, however, is the name of the driver that printer uses. Now, this is where things get a little sketchy. This driver, I don't know, HP LaserJet 5 MP or 5 whatever. That driver has to be available on any virtual desktops that are receiving this rule for the rule to actually work. So if you played with Citrix before, you know that the distribution of these drivers can be a pain in the neck. So be aware that you're going to have to deliver those drivers at the virtual desktop, okay, into the virtual desktop through some other mechanism before you even get this far. This is going to be the thing. If a person is, again, out here on Mars, and this is an HP LaserJet 5, well, this is the driver you're going to have to support here, okay? So just be conscious of that. The last piece here is the IP port or thin print port that you would use for a network printer. That's going to be the IP address of the printer it starts with IP underscore, so 192.168.0.100, whatever. The last piece over here, you can set this as, it's all the way on the left, as the default printer or not the default printer. And then when you're done with that, you can continue to add additional rows as you see fit. So that's the whole printing process here as it relates to setting up location-based printing here in VMware View. Okay, this would stay enabled. You map this to the organizational unit that contains your virtual desktops, and then this will configure those virtual desktops to support whatever that IP addressing is. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about printing, specifically location-based printing, or really any kind of printing with View desktops. We talked about how really you have to make some very terminal services, RDS-like decisions whenever you're configuring printing, specifically remote printing in desktop virtualization. We also talked about down here how there is a DLL file and some GPOs that you'll also have to configure in order to support, determining who gets what printers and for what reason. And we also spoke a little bit about kind of the design decision-making process you would make so that you can use the optimization tools as best as possible so that those optimization tools can ensure a print job stays spooled and compressed for as long as possible until it gets out to that client endpoint. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.